In the bitter cold of the Eastern Front, where the brutal war between Germany and the Soviet Union raged on, a unique and fierce group of warriors entered the battlefield, the Spanish Blue Division. These men were no ordinary soldiers. They were survivors of a bloody civil war, veterans with years of combat experience that had shaped them into one of Spain's most battle-hardened and elite forces. Though Spain remained officially neutral in the Second World War, these volunteers joined the fight alongside Hitler's Wehrmacht, driven by a mix of personal convictions, ideological loyalty, and the lingering scars of their own nation's civil conflict, and to take the fight to the communists. These soldiers found themselves facing not just the unrelenting Soviet war machine, but also the unforgiving elements of the Eastern Front. Fighting in conditions that would break lesser men, the Spanish Blue Division proved time and again that they were more than capable of holding their ground against the Soviet tide. With every clash, they cemented their place as an elite force within Germany's military ranks, earning respect for their discipline, resolve, and their iron will to fight in the face of overwhelming odds. This is the story of Spain's most formidable warriors, soldiers who were driven by more than just orders from Berlin. They fought for their own reasons, whether it was revenge, redemption, or a desire to prove themselves in a global conflict that was reshaping the world. These men would carve their legacy into the frozen battlefields of the Soviet Union, becoming a part of one of history's most brutal campaigns. On December 4th, 1941, amid temperatures plunging to an unbearable -40°C, the Blue Division, composed of Spanish volunteers fighting alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front, faced overwhelming odds against a numerically superior Soviet force, outnumbered 2-1. Despite these daunting conditions, the Spaniards fought with tenacity, managing to reclaim lost ground from the Soviets. However, the aftermath of the battle revealed a horrifying scene, a grotesque mass of snow-covered bodies, hundreds of their comrades who had been captured and gruesomely tortured to death by Soviet forces. Driven by a thirst for vengeance, a group of Blue Division soldiers soon located a Red Army infantry battalion attempting to cross a frozen river. In a swift and merciless counterattack, the Spaniards unleashed a devastating barrage of machine gun fire, obliterating the entire Soviet unit. These Spanish soldiers, known as guerrillas, were renowned for their ferocity, especially when faced with dire circumstances. Their resolve mirrored that of their Russian adversaries, and they fought with relentless determination. One soldier famously declared, "The only thing left for us is to die in the best possible style." Surrender was rare for both sides, as brutal scenes of execution became common, with many choosing death over captivity. On December 27, 1941, the Spaniards discovered the bodies of their comrades nailed to the frozen ground by Soviet ice picks. One of the fallen, bearing an ice pick driven into his forehead, a grisly reminder of the savagery of the conflict. As the brutal winter of 1941 to 1942 intensified, the freezing conditions ravaged both men and machines. Entire German units were decimated, their soldiers frozen in place like frost-covered statues. Vehicles stalled in the cold, horses died en masse, and in some cases, soldiers succumbed to the elements, their cerebral fluid freezing beneath their helmets. The relentless cold brought an additional layer of horror to an already brutal war. By January 1942, temperatures dropped even further, plunging to an unimaginable -55°C. A German infantry division became trapped near Lake Ilmen, encircled and facing annihilation by Soviet forces. General Muñoz Grandes, the commander of the Blue Division, dispatched his men on a daring rescue mission. A force of 370 Spaniards on skis, along with a Latvian platoon of 40 men and 70 anti-Soviet Russian auxiliaries equipped with horse-drawn sleds, embarked on an 11-day trek across the frozen lake. After 2 relentless days of brutal combat, only 14 Spaniards remained standing, their numbers decimated but their spirit unbroken. Against all odds, their determination shattered the Soviet forces, paving the way for the daring rescue of a besieged German division. Amidst the unforgiving winter and staggering losses, their mission became a legendary testament to the resolve, courage, and sheer willpower of the Blue Division, standing tall in the face of one of the most savage winters of the war. General Muñoz Grandes often praised the resilience and tenacity of his men, famously declaring, "The enemy is tough and the Russian winter is tougher, but my men are the toughest of all. You are the pride of our race. Trust in God and attack like true Spaniards." The Blue Division soldiers rarely surrendered, much like the Imperial Japanese Army in the Pacific. They often fought to the death, driven by an intense nationalistic pride and a fierce determination to uphold their honour on the battlefield. Among the ranks of the Blue Division were the Africanistas, veterans of the brutal Moroccan campaigns, whose ruthless combat style struck fear into the Red Army. These seasoned fighters often mutilated the bodies of fallen Soviet soldiers, returning them to their own lines, missing ears, noses, or fingers, a practice that sowed terror among their enemies. Muñoz Grandes nicknamed them the bridegrooms of death for their fearlessness and brutal efficiency in combat. Whether in attack or defense, they forced Soviet surrenders with little more than knives, bayonets, entrenching tools, or even rifle butts. Their battle cry, "Where does the road lead?" was answered with the resolute phrase, "To glory." Spain's involvement in Hitler's campaign against the Soviet Union can be traced to the political turmoil of the early 1930s. In April 1931, King Alfonso XIII was forced into exile after a pivotal election brought a coalition of communists and socialists, who called themselves Republicans, into power. The electorate had grown disillusioned with the king's rule, especially his association with the authoritarian Prime Minister Miguel Primo de Rivera. Rivera's dictatorship and his handling of the unpopular war in Morocco had led to widespread dissent, culminating in the overthrow of centuries of Spanish monarchical tradition. This political shift set the stage for Spain's alignment with fascist ideologies during the Spanish Civil War and its eventual collaboration with Nazi Germany in World War II. Spain, although officially neutral in World War II, sent volunteers to fight on the Eastern Front in the form of the Blue Division. This was partly due to Francisco Franco's desire to repay Adolf Hitler for the support the Nazis had provided during the Spanish Civil War, and partly because of Franco's fervent anti-communist stance. The Blue Division, made up of Spanish volunteers, represented Spain's indirect contribution to the Axis war effort against the Soviet Union, marking Spain's complicated but significant involvement in the broader conflict of World War II. By early 1936, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, disillusioned with the political direction of Spain under its leftist government, initiated a military coup, sparking the bloody and protracted Spanish Civil War. Franco's nationalist forces made rapid gains early on, securing much of northern and western Spain. However, fierce resistance persisted in key urban strongholds such as Madrid, Barcelona, and Toledo, forcing Franco to seek external support to turn the tide of war in his favour. Franco turned to Adolf Hitler and Italy's Benito Mussolini for assistance. Both leaders, eager to expand their influence in Spain and fortify new power in Europe, agreed to aid Franco's nationalists. Hitler and Mussolini viewed Spain as a strategic ally in their broader ideological and military ambitions. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sent significant military aid, including aircraft, troops, and heavy weaponry, to bolster Franco's forces. In August 1937, Hitler formalised his military support by establishing the Condor Legion, a 19,000-man combined air and ground task force led by General Hugo Sperler and Colonel Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma. The Condor Legion brought over 100 bombers and fighter planes to Spain, testing the effectiveness of German air power in combat. Mussolini, eager to match Hitler's commitment, deployed the Aviazione Legionaria, an Italian air unit with more than 700 aircraft and 6,000 personnel, along with the Corpo Truppa Volontari, a contingent of 78,500 ground troops. Italy's forces played a crucial role in key ground offensives alongside the nationalists. One of the most notorious moments of German involvement came when Hitler, intrigued by the potential of air power to decimate cities, authorised General Sperl to conduct bombing campaigns across Spain. This culminated in the infamous air raid on the Basque town of Guernica on April 26, 1937, an attack that left hundreds dead and symbolized the devastating impact of modern warfare on civilian populations. While Germany dominated the air war, Mussolini's forces played a key role in ground combat, contributing to the nationalists' overall success. The nationalists also benefited from large shipments of arms and ammunition from both Germany and Italy, significantly bolstering their capabilities. In response, the Republican forces sought aid from the Soviet Union, which provided aircraft, tanks, and other supplies to counter the nationalists' growing military strength. Despite Soviet aid, the Republicans were increasingly outmatched, especially as the nationalists maintained their momentum with foreign backing. The Spanish Civil War dragged on until March 1939, when Franco's nationalists emerged victorious, solidifying his dictatorship. Just 6 months later, as Europe plunged into World War II, Hitler sought to capitalize on the support he had given Franco by requesting Spanish military assistance against France and Britain. However, Franco, despite having been heavily reliant on Hitler and Mussolini during the Civil War, hesitated, weakened by the Civil War and wary of involving Spain in another devastating conflict. Franco ultimately declined Hitler's request and kept Spain neutral during World War II, despite maintaining ideological ties to the Axis powers. Franco's stance towards World War II shifted significantly when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in the summer of 1941. Having fought against communism during the Spanish Civil War, Franco saw Nazi Germany's battle with the Soviet Union as a continuation of the ideological struggle he had waged in Spain. For Franco, this was not just a geopolitical conflict, but an ideological war against the forces he abhorred, Soviet communism, which he viewed as the center of atheism and a grave threat to the Catholic Church. The invasion of the Soviet Union presented an opportunity to strike at these ideological enemies, and Franco felt a strong sense of obligation to reciprocate the support Germany had provided during the Spanish Civil War. However, rather than formally committing Spain's regular army to the conflict, Franco chose a different path. He called for volunteers to fight on the Eastern Front. The response from the Spanish populace was overwhelming, with enough men volunteering to form a full division of 18,700 troops. This unit became known as the Blue Division, División Azul, named after the blue uniforms worn by Franco's nationalist forces during the Civil War. The Blue Division was integrated into the German Wehrmacht as the 250th Infantry Division, and its men served under German command while maintaining a distinct Spanish identity. In addition to ground forces, Spain also contributed to the air campaign by providing 5 fighter squadrons. These squadrons, known as the Blue Squadron Escuadrilla Azul, flew alongside the Luftwaffe in the skies over the Eastern Front, though Spain officially maintained its neutrality in World War II. The involvement of the Blue Division and Blue Squadron made Spain a key participant in the German campaign against the Soviet Union. Franco's decision to contribute a volunteer force rather than regular army units allowed him to show solidarity with Hitler's anti-communist crusade while avoiding full-scale involvement in the broader war, thus protecting Spain from the direct consequences of conflict with the Allies. General Agustín Muñoz Grandes was indeed a prominent and influential figure in both Spain's military and political landscapes, particularly under Franco's regime. Born in 1896 in the working-class district of Carabanchel Bajo, Madrid, Muñoz Grandes pursued a military career from an early age, graduating from the Infantry Academy in Toledo just before World War I. Despite Spain's neutrality in the war, Muñoz Grandes sought action by volunteering for service in Spanish Morocco. His leadership in commanding native regulares units during the brutal Rif War allowed him to rise rapidly through the ranks, ultimately forming his own elite unit, a Jaca named after him, and earning a reputation for being both efficient and fearless in combat. Muñoz Grandes' career took a dramatic turn when the Spanish Republic was established in 1931, and he was appointed to lead the Assault Guards, a paramilitary force designed to counterbalance the influence of the more conservative Guardia Civil. However, after the leftist Popular Front came to power in 1936, he was dismissed from this post. When the Spanish Civil War broke out later that year, Muñoz Grandes found himself in a precarious position in Republican-controlled Madrid. Nearly killed by a militia or a mob, he was remarkably rescued by his former comrades in the Assault Guards, with the help of Republican General Vicente Rojo. Though initially imprisoned by the Republican government, Muñoz Grandes eventually escaped to join Franco's nationalist forces. During the Spanish Civil War, Muñoz Grandes rose to prominence, commanding a nationalist army corps and distinguishing himself in key battles such as the Battle of Malaga in 1937. His leadership and courage, which earned him 9 wounds in combat, made him one of the most respected generals among Franco's nationalist supporters. After Franco's victory in 1939, Muñoz Grandes took on key roles in Franco's regime, including as General Secretary of the Movement and Chief of the Falangist militia. His close affiliation with the Falange, whose blue uniforms later inspired the Blue Division's name, reflected his importance in the regime's military and political apparatus. Muñoz Grandes had a complex relationship with other leading figures in Franco's regime, particularly with Ramón Serrano Suñer, Franco's influential brother-in-law and Spain's foreign minister. Serrano Suñer, keen on aligning Spain more closely with Nazi Germany, proposed sending a Spanish volunteer division to fight on the Eastern Front after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Hitler, though more interested in Spain's strategic importance in a possible war against Britain, especially concerning Gibraltar, accepted the offer. This led to the formation of the Blue Division, Division Azul, with Muñoz Grandes chosen to command the entire force. Muñoz Grandes quickly earned the respect of both his German counterparts and his own men for his leadership and military prowess. The Germans admired him not only for his capabilities, but also for his charm and resilience in battle. British military intelligence even recognised him as one of their best and most resolute generals. His leadership on the Eastern Front brought him significant recognition, and his achievements were acknowledged when he was later honoured as Captain General of all Spain. Despite the Blue Division's eventual withdrawal in 1943, Muñoz Grandes' military career and contributions to Franco's Spain cemented his legacy as one of the most respected and formidable figures in 20th century Spanish history. The newly formed Blue Division, Division Azul, was a unique fusion of Spain's military and political elements composed of both regular army personnel and members of the Falangist militia. Initially numbering around 18,000 officers and men, the division's ranks would ultimately swell to around 40,000 Spaniards over time as additional volunteers joined the campaign. Franco's decision to appoint General Agustín Muñoz Grandes as its commander was as much a political move as it was military. Muñoz Grandes was a rising star and potential domestic rival, and Franco saw his appointment as a way to remove him from the political scene. Ramón Serrano Suñer, Franco's brother-in-law and foreign minister, similarly supported the nomination, viewing Muñoz Grandes as a threat to his own influence. The volunteers who joined the Blue Division adopted the slogan, "We pay the Russians a return visit," a reflection of their belief that the Soviet Union, as the birthplace of communism, was now facing retribution from Spain's staunchly anti-communist forces. For many Spaniards, this was seen as a continuation of the ideological battle they had fought during the Spanish Civil War. The Blue Division's uniforms symbolized Spain's diverse political factions. Volunteers wore the blue shirts of the Falangists, the red berets of the Carlists, and the khaki trousers of the Spanish Foreign Legion. The ensemble was completed with black boots for the enlisted men, known as guaripas. Officers, on the other hand, wore red berets, khaki tunics with blue accents, leather harness belts, and high black boots. The predominance of blue in their attire quickly led to the division being known as the Blue Division. The official formation of the Blue Division began on July 4, 1941, just a few weeks after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The men of the Blue Division celebrated their creation by singing the Falangist anthem, and proudly referred to themselves as the bridegrooms of death, highlighting their readiness to sacrifice themselves for the cause. The division's departure was a highly publicised event. On July 13, 1941, less than 3 weeks after the Eastern Front had opened, a large and enthusiastic crowd in Madrid gathered to bid farewell to 19 trains carrying 17,924 troops on their way to Germany. The spectacle underscored the fervent nationalism and anti-communism driving many of the volunteers. While most of the division travelled overland, Muñoz Grandes travelled separately, flying ahead in a Lufthansa Focke-Wulf Condor 200. His separate journey underscored his leadership role and the significant expectations placed on him as the Blue Division prepared to take its place in the German campaign against the Soviet Union. This deployment marked Spain's indirect involvement in World War II, where, while officially neutral, it contributed significantly to the fight against communism, maintaining Franco's careful balance of alignment with the Axis while avoiding direct conflict with the Allies. On the morning of July 31st, 1941, under the ominous grey skies of the Grafenwehr training grounds in southeastern Germany, the Blue Division assembled to formally swear allegiance to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. These Spanish volunteers had come to fight communism alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front. The day began with a Catholic Mass, reflecting Spain's deep-rooted religious traditions. Then, in a symbolic act of commitment, General Agustin Muñoz Grandes drew his sword as the soldiers prepared to take their oath. An officer addressed the assembled men, asking, "Do you swear before God and on your honor as Spaniards, absolute obedience to the Supreme Commander of the German Army, Adolf Hitler, in the fight against communism, and do you swear to fight as valiant soldiers, ready at any time to sacrifice your lives in fulfillment of this oath?" In response, with their right arms raised in the fascist salute, the Spaniards roared in unison, "Yes, I swear." The scene was reminiscent of medieval chivalry, evoking the kind of heroism that Franco envisioned for modern Spain, often drawing comparisons to the legendary El Cid. With this oath, the Blue Division, now officially designated as the 250th Infantry Division, was fully incorporated into the German armed forces. Muñoz Grandes, a figure of both military prowess and fierce nationalism, then addressed his troops. "Spanish volunteers, soldiers of honor of my motherland, before the glorious flags of Germany and Spain, you have sworn to die before allowing barbarous Bolshevism to continue its work of hatred and destruction which has already bloodied our motherland, and which today criminally attempts to impose itself on all of Europe. You only wish to destroy this monster, this lash of humanity in its own lair. Tell the Führer that we are ready and at his orders. Tell him that we have sworn the oath, and tell him that my people fulfills what it swears." Muñoz Grandes' words were a powerful declaration of loyalty and resolve, a promise to stand by Hitler's forces in their shared mission to destroy communism. True to his word, Muñoz Grandes led the Blue Division with distinction. Hitler, later impressed by their performance on the battlefield, praised the Spaniards, remarking that the Blue Division was the only virile Latin race equal to the best German divisions, a comment widely interpreted as a slight against Mussolini's Italian forces, which had struggled in their campaigns. By the autumn of 1941, the Blue Division arrived on the Eastern Front. Initially slated to join Army Group Center in the assault on Moscow, their orders were redirected and they were assigned to Army Group North, which was advancing toward Leningrad. There, the Spaniards would play a critical role in the grueling siege of Leningrad, enduring the ferocity of the Soviet winter and facing the determined resistance of the Red Army. The brutal conditions of the Eastern Front tested the Blue Division's resolve, but their participation in the siege cemented their reputation as one of the most formidable foreign contingents in Hitler's campaign against the Soviet Union. Initially, the disciplined and regimented German forces were taken aback by the behaviour of their Spanish allies in the Blue Division. One historian described the Spanish soldiers as an undisciplined bunch of macho men who showed little regard for traditional military protocol. They routinely ignored standard practices such as drills, marching in formation, saluting, or even consistently wearing their uniforms. Instead, they often indulged in chasing local women, particularly Russian Jewesses, much to the frustration of their German counterparts. Field Marshal Hans-Günther von Kluge, exasperated by their lack of discipline, famously quipped, "Are they soldiers or gypsies?" Despite these antics, the Spanish soldiers made it clear that their primary mission in the Soviet Union was to fight communists, not to aid Germany in its broader war aims. Their disregard for many German military customs was balanced by their fierce dedication to battle. Once deployed to the front, General Muñoz Grandes quickly demonstrated his effectiveness as a commander. He reassured Hitler of the Blue Division's fighting spirit, boldly declaring, "We will recuperate in the line. My soldiers will fight to the death." The Blue Division's reputation for bravery was underscored by their battle cry, "Long live death," a chilling testament to their fearlessness and readiness to sacrifice. In October 1941, just before the onset of the brutal Russian winter, the Blue Division marched to the front lines, taking up a critical position along a 30-mile stretch of the Volkhov River. Their sector extended from the southern shore of Lake Ladoga to Lake Ilmen in the Novgorod Oblast, south of Leningrad. This assignment placed them directly in the heart of the fierce fighting as the Germans pressed their assault on Leningrad. Despite the challenges of the terrain and the ferocity of the Soviet resistance, the Spanish soldiers quickly earned a reputation for their tenacity and courage in battle, standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Their positioning along the Volkhov River, a key area in the defense and siege operations surrounding Leningrad, became one of the most hotly contested sections of the front. In these harsh conditions, the Blue Division would prove their mettle, living up to Muñoz Grandes' promises and their fierce battle cries, distinguishing themselves as a fearsome fighting force in the brutal Eastern Front campaign. The Blue Division first entered combat on October 12, 1941, quickly securing a victory in its initial engagement. This success bolstered their morale as they advanced southward toward Dubrovka, a city about 100 miles southwest of Moscow. Under General Muñoz Grandes' leadership, the division captured Dubrovka, but their triumph came at a steep cost. Over the next 3 weeks, the Spanish soldiers, or guerrillas, were forced to fend off relentless Red Army counterattacks, testing their endurance and resolve. Fighting in the brutal territory between Moscow and Leningrad, the Blue Division soon gained a fearsome reputation. Known for their fierce and unyielding combat style, they earned the respect of their German allies and instilled dread in their Soviet enemies. One German general remarked that the Spaniards fought with such intensity, it seemed as though the Russians had stolen their wives. The Blue Division's willingness to engage in close quarters combat and fight with tenacity underlined their reputation as formidable fighters. The winter of 1942 brought even more intense and bitter fighting, exacerbated by the freezing cold of the Russian winter. On January 21st, an 800-man battalion of the Blue Division was almost completely wiped out during a Soviet assault, with only 42 survivors emerging from the onslaught. In February, the division faced another existential threat as the Red Army launched an offensive aimed at splitting the Axis lines. Fighting through a fierce blizzard which blinded both sides, a combined counterattack by German, Walloon, Belgian and Latvian forces saved the Blue Division from destruction. As the Soviets retreated, the Spanish guerrillas taunted them with cries of "Otro toro," or "send in another bull," a phrase rooted in their bullfighting culture, symbolizing their readiness for more combat. Struggling against the bitter cold, the Spaniards stripped the bodies of dead Soviet soldiers for warmer clothing and pried weapons from their frozen hands to continue the fight. Meanwhile, the Spanish Air Force squadrons, 22 pilots strong, made a significant impact on the Eastern Front. They managed to shoot down 156 Soviet aircraft, earning further accolades and contributing to the division's growing reputation for effectiveness in the air and on the ground. The Blue Division's tenacity and loyalty to the Axis cause impressed Adolf Hitler, who publicly praised their efforts in an April 26, 1942 speech to the German Reichstag at Berlin's Kroll Opera House. Hitler stated, "The Spaniards have done all that we ask of our own soldiers," adding, "They and their general, Muñoz Grandes, know the meaning of loyalty and bravery unto death." In recognition of his exceptional leadership, Hitler personally awarded General Muñoz Grandes the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, one of the most prestigious honours in the German military. As the spring thaw arrived, the Germans resumed their offensive and the depleted Blue Division was thrust back into battle at Bolshoye Shemoshe east of the Kresty River. Despite their reduced numbers, the Spaniards fought with remarkable valour. At nearby Maloye Shemoshe, the Blue Division inflicted devastating losses on the Soviets, killing or capturing over 5,000 Russian soldiers while suffering only 274 casualties themselves. This impressive performance further solidified their reputation as a fierce and effective fighting force, respected by both their allies and enemies. Muñoz Grandes was replaced as commander of the Blue Division by Brigadier General Emilio Esteban Infantes, who would also receive the prestigious Knight's Cross on October 5, 1943. Esteban Infantes, a skilled leader, had ambitious plans to raise a second division of Spanish volunteers to continue fighting alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front. However, these plans were cut short as Franco, always a shrewd political operator, began to shift Spain's stance toward neutrality. The German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk in 1943 marked turning points in the war, prompting Franco to reassess Spain's alignment with the Axis powers. In September 1942, Franco took a significant step in signalling Spain's growing distance from the Axis by replacing his pro-Axis foreign minister, Ramon Serrano Suñer, his own brother-in-law, with a pro-Allied general. This move demonstrated Spain's drift towards neutrality, as the tides of war began to turn against Hitler's forces. Meanwhile, Muñoz Grandes, having returned to Spain on May 24, 1942, was given a hero's welcome in Madrid. Franco promoted him to Lieutenant General, recognizing his military accomplishments and the respect he had earned both at home and abroad. However, Franco was also keenly aware of Muñoz Grandes' growing popularity and the potential threat he posed as a figure who could challenge his leadership. Muñoz Grandes was seen as a potential future leader of Spain by the Germans, who admired his military prowess. There was speculation in Germany that if Spain formally joined the Axis, Muñoz Grandes would be appointed Minister of the Interior, a role that would have given him authority similar to Heinrich Himmler's in Nazi Germany, controlling internal security forces. Some even believed that Muñoz Grandes might lead a Spanish military junta that could pressure Franco into formally aligning Spain with the Axis and requesting German arms. This possibility alarmed Franco, who sought to maintain his control over Spain's delicate political situation. To manage the potential threat posed by Muñoz Grandes, Franco offered the general two options: a new cabinet post or the position of Spanish ambassador to Berlin. Muñoz Grandes, however, rejected both offers, unwilling to become a tool of those he viewed as reactionary elements within Franco's government or the Axis powers. This refusal highlighted his independent streak and unwillingness to be manipulated for political purposes. By 1942, the Blue Division had suffered significant losses, not only from combat but also from the harsh conditions of the Russian winter. Franco, recognizing the toll the war was taking on his troops and wary of further entanglement with the faltering Axis cause, decided to recall the division and its commander. Nevertheless, thousands of committed volunteers refused to return home, preferring to continue the fight against communism. These soldiers, along with fresh reinforcements, reformed as the Legion Azul, Blue Legion, under the command of Miguel Izquierda, and remained on the Eastern Front, fighting alongside the Germans until the bitter end of the war. Back in Spain, Muñoz Grandes was honoured with the highest accolades from the Phalangists, solidifying his status as a national hero. Yet this prominence also raised concerns within Franco's regime. Franco, ever the calculating strategist, recognised that Muñoz Grandes's military successes, popularity, and close ties with Germany made him a potential rival for power. While publicly celebrating the general's accomplishments, Franco remained vigilant, keeping a close watch on Muñoz Grandes to ensure that his influence did not grow to the point where it could threaten Franco's leadership. Despite their shared past, Franco understood that in the volatile political landscape of wartime Spain, even a hero could become a rival. In August 1942, the Legion Azul, Blue Legion, was moved north to reinforce the southeastern flank of the siege of Leningrad, strategically positioned near Pushkin, close to the Izhora and Neva rivers. By February 1943, the situation grew increasingly desperate, as the Soviet 55th Army launched a massive assault on the Spanish positions during the Battle of Krasny Bor, a crucial point near the Moscow-Leningrad road. Despite being outnumbered 7-1, the Spanish forces displayed remarkable resilience. Although they suffered devastating casualties, they managed to hold their ground, containing the Soviet attack and prolonging the siege of Leningrad for another year. As the relentless fighting continued, the ranks of the Blue Legion thinned significantly. Franco, aware of the growing toll on the Spanish volunteers, sent reinforcements throughout the summer of 1943, consisting of a mix of new volunteers and conscripts to bolster the depleted numbers. However, as losses mounted and reinforcements slowed, the Germans began integrating the remaining Spanish units into Waffen SS divisions, such as the Panzer Grenadier Nordland Division and the Storm Brigade Wallonien. Despite these reinforcements, the Spanish troops continued to endure heavy fighting, playing key roles in Germany's fighting retreats throughout 1943 and 1944, particularly on the Eastern Front. The Spaniards fought not only in Russia, but also participated in operations against anti-German resistance in Yugoslavia, Romania, particularly in Bukovina, and even in France. Some Spanish units even found themselves participating in Germany's last major offensive in the West, the infamous Ardennes Offensive, Battle of the Bulge, in late 1944. By late summer 1943, diplomatic pressure on Spain to withdraw its forces from the Eastern Front had intensified. The Allies, particularly Britain, were applying significant pressure on Franco to distance Spain from the Axis. On August 20th, 1943, British Ambassador Sir Samuel Hoare met with Franco and General Muñoz Grandes, formally requesting the withdrawal of Spanish forces from Russia. Recognizing the shifting tides of the war and aware that Germany was increasingly on the defensive, Franco began to recalibrate Spain's position. 6 weeks later, on October 1st, 1943, Franco officially declared Spain's neutrality in the European conflict, signaling the end of Spain's military involvement on the Eastern Front. The withdrawal of the Blue Legion was a turning point in Spain's involvement in World War II. Although the most committed volunteers continued to fight alongside the Germans, Franco's decision marked the beginning of Spain's efforts to distance itself from the Axis powers and avoid the consequences of being on the losing side of the war. The Blue Legion faced its darkest days in December 1943. Ordered by the Germans to hold a tenuous 6.5-mile front at Kostovo, the Spaniards found themselves dangerously spread thin, with enough space between each soldier that 2 tanks could pass side by side. On Christmas Day, the Soviet forces launched their assault. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Spanish legionnaires held firm, refusing to surrender. They picked off advancing Soviet troops for days, eventually holding out for weeks. In the midst of battle, when surrounded, the Red Army taunted the Spanish soldiers, urging them to kill your officers and join us. However, the Spaniards remained resolute. As a final act of defiance, whenever forced to retreat, they would remove the crosses from their makeshift cemeteries so that the Soviets could not desecrate the bodies of their fallen comrades. In early January 1944, the Legion was finally ordered to abandon their positions amid a fierce blizzard. The surviving troops managed to pull back and reach Estonia by January 7th. Exhausted, frozen and battle-weary, they were reassigned to guard the Baltic Sea coast, giving them a brief respite from the relentless combat they had endured on the Eastern Front. By February 20th, 1944, Adolf Hitler informed Franco that the Blue Legion had fulfilled its duties and would be sent home. On March 6th, many of the surviving Gueripas gathered for their final journey back to Spain. During the somber ceremony, one officer addressed the troops stating, "This is a bitter moment. The Legion must return to Spain and return home with the proud feeling that you have done your duty. On this day of sorrow, you will carry your rifle barrels down, as in a funeral or in Holy Week. Long live the Legion." After the Blue Division was recalled to Spain, the Spanish involvement in the war was far from over. One notable Spanish soldier, Miguel Esquerra Sanchez, continued the fight by commanding his own unit within the Waffen SS, leading a dedicated group of Spanish volunteers on the Eastern and Western Front. Miguel Esquerra's journey with the German army was both extraordinary and perilous, marked by a series of dramatic encounters that shaped his role in World War II. Welcomed into the Wehrmacht, Esquerra's initial deployment took him to East Prussia, where he joined a regiment of 400 Spaniards stationed in Königsberg. His experience there, however, was marred by friction with his fellow countrymen, which led to his reassignment to Paris on a special mission orchestrated by the Gestapo. This mission required Esquerra to travel to Bordeaux and convince as many Spaniards as possible to cross the border and enlist in the German army. For several weeks, he successfully smuggled Spanish recruits across the French border, all of whom were integrated into German ranks. However, on his return to Paris, Esquerra narrowly escaped death when his vehicle was struck by American aircraft fire, leaving him shaken but unharmed. In Paris, Esquerra became entrenched in the circles of Spanish nationals who were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. By the summer of 1944, he was called to the front lines of the Western Front. Now commanding his own unit, dubbed the Esquerra Unit, he led 370 Spaniards flying the Cross of St. Andrew flag to Normandy to face the advancing Allied forces. His unit, integrated into the SS Division Wallonia under Belgian collaborator Léon de Grelle, fought fiercely alongside the elite 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 2nd SS Division Das Reich during the campaign. In brutal close-quarters combat against Allied forces, Esquerra's men faced overwhelming artillery barrages and tank assaults, holding the line under intense pressure. Despite their efforts, the battle proved disastrous, with 65% of Esquerra's men either killed or wounded. The survivors, battered and outnumbered, were forced to conduct a desperate fighting retreat, eventually falling back to Paris, where they regrouped. Amid the chaotic retreat, Esquerra bore witness to the political upheaval that erupted following the failed July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. The aftermath of the conspiracy led to widespread paranoia and unrest within the Nazi ranks. Despite the mounting tension, Esquerra demonstrated unwavering loyalty to the Führer, a move that cemented his position and earned him the trust of his German superiors. However, this loyalty placed him in the middle of the rising resistance against German occupation. The French resistance, emboldened by the weakening Nazi hold, launched a series of insurgencies across the city. Caught in this deadly crossfire, Esquerra's convoy was ambushed by resistance fighters while navigating the streets of Paris. Forced to abandon their vehicle under heavy fire, Esquerra and his companions narrowly escaped after a fierce gunfight, in which they killed a French resistance member. They moved cautiously through the hostile streets, knowing capture would mean certain death. The tension mounted as they realized the scale of the uprising. In a grim twist of fate, as Esquerra and his comrades pressed on, they encountered Spanish soldiers from the Republican La Nueva division, once their sworn enemies during the Spanish Civil War, now part of the Allied forces liberating the city. These Republican veterans, who had fought fiercely against Franco and his nationalist supporters, including Esquerra, now stood as victors in the streets of Paris. It was a bitter moment of realization, former foes now aligned with the forces bringing the German occupation to an end. The sight was a haunting reminder of the shifting tides of war as Esquerra and his dwindling unit made their escape, forever marked by the bitter irony of fighting their own countrymen in a foreign land. Esquerra and his unit retreated to Strasbourg, where they regrouped in preparation for one of the last major German offensives of the war, the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Thrust into the icy, forested terrain of Belgium, Esquerra's men fought with fierce determination. Using their experience from earlier brutal campaigns, they successfully located and ambushed unsuspecting American troops, launching a devastating surprise assault. In a matter of hours, the Spaniards inflicted heavy casualties, killing numerous American soldiers and capturing prisoners. Remarkably, they suffered only minimal losses themselves, just 3 dead and 2 wounded. Yet, despite these early successes, the larger Ardennes offensive proved to be a failure for the Germans. The relentless Allied counterattacks, combined with the brutal winter conditions, turned the tide against the Wehrmacht. Esquerra, like many others, struggled to survive the freezing temperatures. The harsh cold took a toll on him personally, and he was debilitated by severe frostbite. He lost 2 phalanges on 3 toes, an injury that required immediate surgery. After a grueling recovery in a hospital in Wiesbaden, he was barely fit for further combat, but the war was far from over. Following his recovery, Esquerra was reassigned to Berlin as the Nazi regime faced its final days. The shattered city, surrounded by Soviet forces, would be his final battleground. As the Red Army closed in, Esquerra found himself once again entrenched in desperate fighting, this time against impossible odds. In the crumbling heart of the Third Reich, Esquerra scrambled to assemble a fighting force from the remnants of foreign volunteers still loyal to the Third Reich. Drawing upon his reputation and connections, he recruited Spaniards from various backgrounds, including die-hard phalangists, hardened Blue Division veterans, and even civilians who had been living in Germany throughout the war. Despite the war's hopelessness, Esquerra's charisma and conviction brought together a motley group of soldiers. His ranks were further bolstered by 17 Frenchmen, former collaborators with the Nazi regime, 4 Walloon Belgians, and even a Latvian non-commissioned officer. Though small in number, this diverse unit embodied a mix of nationalism, desperation, and loyalty to a fading regime. Initially, they were sent to Stettin, where they were tasked with defending a key bridgehead over the Oder River, a critical lifeline for retreating German forces. The battle-hardened Spaniards and their international comrades fought with fierce determination, knowing that failure meant the collapse of the Eastern Front. Yet, as Soviet forces continued their relentless push westward, the situation became untenable. By April 1945, with Soviet troops closing in on Berlin from all sides, Esquerra and his men were pulled back to the capital in a last-ditch effort to defend what remained of Hitler's regime. In the ruined streets of Berlin, under constant bombardment and facing insurmountable odds, Esquerra's unit prepared for the final battle. Surrounded by the shattered remnants of the German military and fellow foreign volunteers, they knew the end was near. Amid the chaos and devastation of the Battle of Berlin, Esquerra's unit was entrusted with defending a sector near the strategically vital Air Ministry. Surrounded by Soviet forces on all sides, the city had become a war-torn labyrinth of rubble and barricades, where street fighting was fierce and unforgiving. Esquerra's men, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with grim determination. Utilizing guerrilla tactics, they managed to hold their ground, ambushing Soviet infantry and destroying several Russian tanks with Panzerfausts in daring close-quarters engagements. One notable event happened, though some historians have often doubted it happened since there is no proof. But there is also no proof that it didn't happen. Despite the collapsing front, word of his unit's successes reached the highest echelons of the German leadership. In an extraordinary moment, Esquerra was summoned to the Führer bunker itself, a rare honour as the Nazi regime crumbled around them. It is said that Adolf Hitler personally awarded Esquerra the prestigious Knight's Cross, one of the highest military decorations in the German army, in recognition of his bravery and loyalty. This is often a little bit of a hot topic because there is no proof, only his words, but for this video we will include this and you can make your own judgment. The story has passed into legend, with reports suggesting that the meeting between Esquerra and Hitler lasted only a few minutes. As Berlin crumbled beneath the relentless Soviet advance, Esquerra and his remaining men received orders to attempt the impossible, escape the city now fully encircled by enemy forces. With the city in ruins, they embarked on a desperate and dangerous breakout. Navigating through streets littered with rubble and corpses, they dodged Soviet patrols and artillery fire, the sound of gunfire echoing through the ruins. The harrowing journey was marked by constant danger, with every turn potentially leading to death or capture. Esquerra himself was wounded in the leg during the escape, but he pressed on, leading his men to the relative safety of the Excelsior Hotel, a former symbol of Berlin's grandeur that had now become a battlefield refuge. There, Esquerra received treatment for his wound, but the respite was brief. By the next morning, with Soviet forces closing in, his unit was forced back into the fight. Once again, they clashed with the advancing Red Army, engaging in vicious street combat. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the Spaniards fought with remarkable tenacity, managing to destroy several more Russian tanks with their limited anti-tank weaponry. Yet, despite their tactical victories, the situation was undeniably hopeless. The Third Reich was in its final throes, and Berlin was a city of the dead, overrun by Soviet soldiers. As the Soviet noose tightened around the heart of the city, Esquerra and his men knew that their efforts, however valiant, could only delay the inevitable. In the chaotic final days of the war, amid the ruins of a collapsing Berlin, Esquerra had a brief encounter with Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest aides, though he didn't recognise the notorious Nazi official at the time. The city was in complete disarray, with high-ranking Nazi officials and ordinary soldiers alike trying to escape the inevitable Soviet capture. As the final order came down for the German forces to surrender, Esquerra and his small band of surviving men, who had fought so fiercely in the streets of Berlin, were left with no choice but to lay down their arms. Captured by Soviet forces, Esquerra and his men were subjected to brutal treatment typical of the Red Army's anger towards those who had defended the Third Reich. Stripped of their possessions, beaten and humiliated, Esquerra was forced into a column of prisoners that included many of his fellow Spaniards, all bound for an uncertain fate. The long march eastward towards Soviet captivity began, a grim journey through the devastated landscapes of a war-torn Europe. Esquerra's escape from Soviet hands was as daring as his exploits during the war. While detained in Poland, he and 5 other Spaniards managed to kill a Soviet guard and flee the camp. They returned to Berlin, where they were sheltered by a sympathetic family. Using forged documents from the Ibero-American Institute, Esquerra posed as an Argentine citizen and made his way to a British-controlled sector, where he was eventually smuggled to Brussels. From there, he crossed into France, working briefly in Dax before stealing a bicycle and embarking on a final escape across the border into Spain. Along the way, he narrowly avoided capture by the French resistance, concluding an odyssey of survival that spanned continents and years. Little is known about the final chapters of Esquerra's life, though what he claimed in later years paints a picture as shadowy and extraordinary as his wartime exploits. In 1982, Spanish journalist Javier Nart interviewed Esquerra for the magazine Interview, where the ex-soldier recounted a series of post-war adventures that stretched the limits of believability. According to Esquerra, shortly after his return to Spain, he was recruited by the Spanish Secret Service. His clandestine activities allegedly led him to enlist in the French Foreign Legion, where he operated as a double agent for the Spanish in the conflict zones of Morocco. He further claimed to have been deployed to Vietnam, adding yet another layer of intrigue to his already incredible story. Dissatisfied with military life, Esquerra stated that he left the Legion and found employment with Dominican dictator Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. His role was to train the Anti-Communist Legion of the Caribbean, a paramilitary force intended to defend Trujillo's regime against communist insurgencies. However, Esquerra claimed that what he witnessed during his time under Trujillo's command deeply unsettled him, prompting him to flee the Caribbean. From there, Ezquerra's path allegedly took him to Brazil and Paraguay, where he established contacts with former Nazis who had fled Europe after the war. In Paraguay, he managed a logging concession, though it ultimately failed, adding to his growing list of misfortunes. After the business endeavour collapsed, Ezquerra purportedly moved to Chile and then Argentina, continuing his shadowy existence among expatriates and former comrades from the war years. In the final act of his elusive journey, Ezquerra returned to Spain. By this point, his wartime heroics and post-war exploits had faded into the past, and he lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Whether all of his claims were true or embellished, the story Ezquerra wove in his interview left an indelible mark on those who heard it, adding an air of myth to a man whose life had already traversed the darkest chapters of 20th century history. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.